Kia ora koutou. This is going to be a whirlwind trip through 100 years of restoration in and around Christchurch, but the film and the PDF will be available online at your leisure. So, why didn't that move? Oh my gosh. No, it moved twice. It's not moving on the, on the side of the screen here. Okay, so we all know about the fact that Canterbury is sort of at ground zero as far as natural heritage is concerned, and the big problem is that extinction of experience, when people no longer see nature, leads to extinction of species. And we've done this because you can. We've got a flat landscape in lowland Canterbury, and it's a very hard road to hoe back because of this obliteration, but also because of the challenging climate here. And so the loss of natural seed sources is a major problem. Now, I don't quite know what's going on here. Page. If I go like that. I wasn't counting on pauses. I want to use the down arrow. Okay. There we go. Right, I'm going to flick through these because we've already lost some time. Arresting biodiversity decline, the problems of globalisation, fashion, the need for carbon sequestration, ecosystem services. We're restoring human communities as much as we are ecosystems, part and parcel of the same thing. The importance of demonstrating and experiencing life processes to achieve legible, meaningful landscapes and also ecological literacy amongst the community and citizens. There's some other sort of practical matters there, and transitioning to a sustainable, kinder world. We all know that we need to do this. So when we're changing things across the landscape, of course we're often conflicting with a whole lot of people's established values, and there's sometimes a resistance to that. Some people want change on their terms, on their own terms, and others don't like it. So there's always a sociological aspect to ecological restoration, both positive and sometimes negative. Through the last 100 years, there's been a whole lot of milestones towards restoration or planting of native vegetation, and starting from the few remnants left on the Canterbury Plains, like ricketed bush, but you can see a whole lot of other sequential key milestones that relate to ecological restoration. Of course, we come right down to the post-earthquake period, and importantly, I'll just focus on the bottom there, the assembly rules that kind of emerge out of this, particularly relating to forest environments, setting up the primary structural elements in the first few years, the secondary tender species, ground covers, vines, and so on, but also coinciding with our noble trees beginning to fruit and produce seedlings. And then the tertiary level, when we are putting on those, the fine detail, the mistletoes, the invertebrates, translocating native invertebrates. So there's just a mosaic of some of those elements that I've been referring to, and importantly note the role of Kaiapoi Pa restoration back in the 80s, which I had the privilege of being involved with Rick Toe. Of course, the first stage of restoration is protecting the important natural remnants, and there are few and far between on the Canterbury Plains, but there were, of course, still some specific cases like Travers Wetland, and some of those have been restored to an almost primeval view of what Christchurch was like at the time of European settlement, at least. The next sort of important aspect, of course, is supporting natural regeneration and succession. And we've got some wonderful examples here within the broader context of the city over at Henawai and Banks Peninsula with the wonderful Hugh Wilson and the work that he's done over the last 20 years or so. And so supporting regeneration is the most valuable kind of restoration, and making sure that that works well. And then when we get to actually planting out new habitats, it's a matter of fitting species to that topo-hydro-edaphic climatic patterns that underpin our landscape. And I sometimes just was thinking about this, that restoration ecologists are really landscape artists. We're painting the plant patterns across that sort of topographic canvas and being sort of faithful to the underlying topographic variation, hydrological conditions. And of course we've provided some information about that through that booklet there on how to put nature into our neighbourhoods. So restoration, we usually tend to think of it in relation to forest or swamp or riparian, but I am going to spend quite a bit of this talk and the images that I'm going to show are going to be about restoring and rebuilding and protecting the ferns and the forbs, the things that are really the threatened species in lowland environments throughout New Zealand. Just a few examples of some of the well-known restoration projects around the city, here at Koala Island, Otamahua. And the other thing that I want to introduce you to, particularly in relation to those more difficult lowland forb restoration, is this wonderful framework that Philip Grime developed years ago around the notion of stress and disturbance and competition, which sort of integrates with those two main axes of ecological circumstances. And you can fundamentally, it's about where different habitats fit and how they should be managed within those two spectra of disturbance and stress. The little picture at the top is actually Poa imbecilla, which grows in only in a very stressed environments around the bases of trees, where there's very little topsoil and it's very limited in moisture. And so it can survive there because of the lack of competition from other bigger, more vigorous exotic grasses. Some examples of stressed environments that we either find naturally or we can recreate in urban contexts is a rock garden. And here is a case, heritage rubble, and also green roofs that we heard about before, where sometimes actually nature regenerates. For example, native orchids naturally regenerate on some of those green roofs, as well as the species that we initially plant there, a whole lot of little herbaceous plants which are now rare elsewhere in the landscape. And this is another case of a rock garden created with a very stressed substrate, with some very rare local and endemic species like the Myosotis there, some geraniums, little epilobiums and Muehlenbeckias and so on. So these places do perform a role, and importantly also for the dependent invertebrates that these depend, that often host specific. Another example where we've used a very stressed substrate on a north-facing sunny slope here on the southern motorway to provide habitats again for these geraniums, leptonellas, Muehlenbeckias, parsonsias and so on. Okay, what about disturbance, the other part of that spectrum? Well, here's a wonderful sort of disturbance factor, a lovely big white mute swan there, and the important thing is that it grazes right up to the length that its neck will stretch, and you can see a clear demarcation between the short turf here with the exotic grasses kind of like reduced in competitiveness, and beyond that you've got a much denser grass sward. And within that short turf there's a whole range of native species which can coexist there with some of the exotic grasses that still hang on but in a much reduced vigour. And another kind of disturbance, of course, is mowing lawns. So we can forget, wet and forget, and Ethel McCulley's magic herbicides to purify our lawns and get rid of all of those flatweeds, when we've got a whole range of native species that coexist in that environment. Grazing, of course, also achieves the same end. I'm now going to really fly through, and believe it or not, even lawn bowls and croquet are a wonderful source of biodiversity in very short turfs. Stripping topsoil to reduce fertility is another way of creating stress. The problem is when there's an absence of grime, you can be too kind to the environment and all the exotic grasses take over the carefully planted silver tussocks there. Riparian environments, I'm now going to really fly through this. Here we've used a dripping tap out of Travers wetland to provide a specially almost sort of gardened environment for some very rare wetland plants like Gratiola, Mazis and so on. And we've also got to stop cleansing and sterilising and sanitising urban wild. That's a new sort of concept which is now kind of becoming widespread around the world, allowing nature to do its thing, allowing a bit of weed growth, reducing the herbicide use and fostering some of those rare native species like the Lactogrossus and Senecio there. And here I see Andrew in the back there. He let the salt water into this embayment under Humphreys Drive, and quickly followed were natural regeneration of salt marsh plants with some assistance from his friends to grow coastal forest species around there. We've also brought pingao back into the city, and spinifex down from Marlborough, and euphorbia up from North Otago to places where they once existed but had disappeared. Coastal bush, protecting dry grassland woody species as part of that restoration, things which are already in the landscape but which are becoming very diminished. Fitting nature into tiny spaces. Even a small pocket park like this can support a whole range of native plants. In fact, this is an exhibit that used entirely native species. There's the green roofs and little sort of little courtyards there. Ecosystem services provided by wetland filters. And quickly scaling up to a whole landscape level where observations of successful dispersal of native plants and seedlings from known seed sources enabled Graham Hall and myself to build this optimised model of patch configurations with corridors and a matrix in between. And this is being applied in Christchurch and also in Auckland now. And this is one of the stepping stones that have been created to fill in the gaps in that model. And then the secondary stage of restoration is bringing in those ground covers like the ferns there, and then understory species like grasses, sedges, nettles, mahoe and other tender species, and ferns, Caprosma rotundifolia there. And then there's a whole range of natural regeneration. Even in Christchurch we've got tawa regenerating incidentally, but Kaikamaka and also Kauaka, which is south of its natural range. The tertiary stage of restoration is when we really get down to the fine detail. Some things get there under their own steam, some birds there, but importantly the mistletoes are being replanted and some of the vines, and then of course fungi, of course, big issue of how to deal with those, but importantly translocation of vertebrates, and there's Mike Bowie there on Quail Island, the geckos as well, betters, beetles and leaf vein ferns. Fish, of course, come into the picture, and then some rather unwanted invertebrates have been invading some of these restoration sites, like scales and caterpillars, sort of hoeing into those scrummy plants packed with nutrients and without any natural biological controls. So micro patches fitting nature into tiny spaces, even on the roofs of some of our buildings. They're going back to the green roof and roof. Yep, 2 minutes. Oh, we've gone well. We can fit all sorts of things on tops of our skyscrapers there. What about even a rock wren, our endangered alpine bird? Yeah, maybe. As we know, just providing patches is not enough. We need to provide sanctuaries, fenced sanctuaries, and there's various proposals in Christchurch, the Banks Peninsula, but also the Waitakere Eco Sanctuary here, based around the long-established Travis wetland and some of the red zone land there. In fact, it's my goal in life to get kakapo back there. Yeah, right. We'll see how we go with that. Corridors, getting more Muhlenbecker to replace that gorse to provide habitat for butterflies and birds and lizards. We'll flip past that one. The kind of conventional sort of riparian waterway enhancement program with our noble trees and the different sequences of zones from the riparian environments. And then we're sort of beginning to wind down now, the importance of joining up people with nature. And this is being done increasingly in all sorts of wonderful creative ways with art and sculpture and the important cultural connections that exist between all of our species and our layers of culture, and particularly tangata whenua. And there's a wonderful case of that, doing exactly that at the entrance to Pegasus Township. And I suppose with all of the post-earthquake rebuild of the city, how we can bring and integrate nature back right into the heart of the city to overcome that extinction of experience I referred to. I like the idea of bringing a kind of bush city like at Wellington foreshore back right into Cathedral Square there and running off the chalice, which represents our buried forests. Okay, final word. When we gathered all of this information and all of this data together over a 4-day period at the end of April in the Global City Nature Challenge involving 160 cities around the world, Christchurch did very well. The total records there were sort of almost a million species, a million records of 32,000 species around the world. Christchurch, we were in the top dozen or so for number of observations and number of species for a city. And when you corrected for population and area, we were in the first 5. Therefore, I'm proposing that we, and I'm hoping all of the other cities represented here today, will join us in becoming National Park City in Christchurch and also other cities around the world. Because, as Bruce said earlier, our cities are rich in biodiversity, it's very threatened, but we often have very green cities, and the important thing is bringing nature and people back together again. And this is one of the kind of ways in which we can do that. Thank you very much.